my remaining voice, we will enter the final frontier of this class, which is obviously, which although it begins in the shopping mall, the proposal, perhaps a little nod to Anatole Ranel, who's quite great in saying such things, that this space actually has some kind of call. So now we come to the Guattari moment of the thing, and it's Guattari calling, right? And what I want to sort of show you is that despite all the people who portray Guattari in particular as the prophet of a kind of mindless nomadism, or I don't know, maybe organs without bodies, or I don't know, of some kind of sort of purely meaningless desire, Guattari developed an extremely critical analysis of the new form of financialized capitalism as it was coming into being in the early 1980s. And in fact, there's a text which actually hasn't been translated into English, to my knowledge, which is called, in my translation, Integrated World Capitalism and the Molecular Revolution, from 1981. And I want to read you a few of the things from that text so that you will see with what acuity he was able to describe all the things that I've been talking about for the last 5 days in their nascent state in the early 1980s when they were just coming into being. This is the kind of farsightedness to which I think one should aspire in a moment of crisis, when we are at a moment where actually the future is coming into being. A very different future is coming into being right now. So we should aspire to this kind of, or we should try to figure out how did they do it in the past and do something different but equally good right now, so as to be ready for and to even somewhat change the future. So Guattari says this, and from now on I'm going to pronounce his name correctly, as I've been reminded that he's not an Italian but a Frenchman. He did hang out with Negri a lot at this time, you know, so we could call him Felix Guattari. Contemporary capitalism can be defined as integrated world capitalism because it tends toward a state where no human activity on the planet can escape it. It can be considered to have already colonized all the planet's surfaces, so that the essential aspect of its expression now concerns the new activities that it seeks to overcome and control. This double movement of self-enclosing geographical extension and proliferating molecular expansion is correlated with the general process of deterritorialization. IWC, Integrated World Capitalism, respects neither existing territorialities, nor traditional modes of life, nor the modes of social organization of national units, which today seem the most well established. In other words, the nation state is on the way out. It recomposes productive and social systems on its own bases, on what I would call its own axiomatics. Axiomatics being opposed here to programs. In other words, there's not a program defined once and for all. It is always capable of adding supplementary functional axioms in the face of a crisis or an unexpected difficulty, or of eliminating them. And of course, at this moment, the axiom that said that you must take care of people's welfare so that they will be able to consume the production of the industrial production was in the course of being eliminated, or at least at the very beginning of being eliminated, as it has continued to be eliminated since then, up until now, when we seem to be in the final crisis of that axiom. Certain capitalist forms seem to collapse on the occasion of a world war or a crisis like that of 1929, then are reborn under other forms, finding other foundations. This continuous deterritorialization and recomposition affects power formations no less than modes of production. I prefer to speak of power formations rather than relations of production, because the second notion is too restrictive with respect to the subject considered here. In other words, the Marxist vocabulary, which sees all of politics as considering the social relations of production, is not enough in a world where symbolic power and where desire have such an important role to play. he thinks that the Marxist idea should be expanded, and indeed he has a text on that which is called The State as the Integral of Capital Formations. Excellent, amazingly good text, but that's for another time. Let's continue with integrated world capitalism and the revolution. As soon as capitalism has invaded the full set of economically exploitable surfaces, it can no longer maintain the expansionist thrust that it had kept up during its colonial and imperialist phases. Its field of action is closed, and that requires it to recompose itself constantly upon itself by deepening its modes of control and subjugation of human societies. Its globalization, far from being a growth factor, corresponds in fact to a radical questioning of its former basis. In other words, this is what financialization is. It's a questioning of the former industrial expansionary basis. Now it must be an intensive involution into our bodies, essentially. This could culminate either in a total involution of the system or in a change of register. IWC will have to find its expansion, its means of growth, by working over the formations of power themselves, by transforming social relations, and by developing ever more artificial markets, not only in the domain of goods, but also of affects. My hypothesis is that the current crisis, the late 70s, continuing recession and so on, which is not really a crisis, but a gigantic reconversion, and this is so true, look what happened ultimately in the East, the total reconversion of the former Soviet space, is precisely, the current crisis is precisely this oscillation between the involution of a certain type of capitalism, that is, say, a reinforcement of the state and of the old system, that very reinforcement you were talking about in terms of union power and the old established powers, an oscillation between that, which runs up against its own closure, and an attempt at restructuring on other bases, that is, expanding into the informational capitalism and the new modes of immaterial products and financialization. IWC needs, in other words, to carry out a decisive reconversion, even if it involves completely liquidating former systems, whether on the level of production or in terms of national compromises with bourgeois democracy or social democracy. Indeed, this appears to be terrifyingly possible now, that social democracy could be wiped out in this crisis, and in favor of a complete sort of rule of informational capital, let's say. This is the end of territorialized capitalisms, of expansive imperialisms, and the shift to intensive and deterritorialized imperialisms. So now this will be me talking, and I just want to go on though to describe some things about Guattari and about this text. With the multiplication of technical environments, audiovisual screens, shopping malls, transport corridors, communication systems, our perceptions are constantly mediated, subject to inflection by pre-programmed flows of language and aesthetic stimulus. These are things that Guattari says all over the place. Perception itself is constructed by the mediated environment in which it takes place. That's a heavy one. That means that what you see is also part of what's being put into you by the environment. Now here, these are things that Guattari probably knew about but doesn't mention in his text. As Herbert Simon, America's premier theorist of modeling, and Guattari was fascinated by the modeling and meta-modeling. Well, Simon is the guy who theorizes models in the United States and for the American military-industrial complex. So as he wrote in the 1981 preface to his book, The Sciences of the Artificial, he wrote the following. The thesis is that certain phenomena are artificial in a very specific sense. They are as they are only because of a system's being molded by goals or purposes to the environment in which it lives. So the system, you have, as Bateson said, organism plus environment. You have a system which is molded to fit the environment. Now it doesn't say whether the system molds itself to fit the environment or whether someone molds the system to fit the environment. He leaves you uncertain about that. The concept of the strategically designed artifact or interface is central to Simon's general program for the environmental management of human behavior. That's what I think. And so now I'm going to quote from Simon where he talks, and he gives the strangest definition of the word artifact you will ever read or hear. He says, an artifact can be thought of as a meeting point, an interface in today's terms, between an inner environment, that is, the substance and organization of the artifact itself, and the outer environment, the surroundings in which it operates. Description of an artist in terms of its organization and functioning, its interface between inner and outer environments, is a major objective of invention and design activity. If the inner system is properly designed, now we're designing the inner system. That's a real slippage in the text. It's like suddenly, if the inner system is properly designed, it will be adapted to the outer environment so that its behavior will be determined in large part by the latter. And this is the thing that kills me. Exactly as in the case of economic man. So what he's saying there, and there's a real slippage, it's not, the 3 dots are not the problem. The problem is in the text itself. Suddenly he's saying, first he says, talking about an artifact, then he's talking about an inner system, then he's saying you design the inner system, then he says if the inner system is properly designed, it will fit perfectly into the environment, just the way Homo economicus fits into the economy. The implication is that Homo economicus, that's the Latin phrase that's used to describe economic man, in economics text. The idea that man is motivated, men and women are motivated by economics, and all their behavior is motivated by economics, and that everybody makes rational choices which are based on maximization of their utility according to its cost and benefit for them. He says that economic man has been designed to fit an environment, and he says that we can do that as design specialists all over the place if we know how to match an inner system to an outer system. So since we're dealing here with shopping malls, I think it would be interesting, and I'm always kind of wondering, am I really in the place where I think I am? Yes, I am, okay. So I think it would be interesting, since we're talking about shopping malls, to look at a very short excerpt by a filmmaker, Harun Farokhi, who made a film called The Creators of Shopping Malls. And you'll see how they set about creating this artificial match between an inner system and an outer system.
Okay, Paul, look at the center dot, the upper left dot, the upper right dot, lower left dot, lower right dot.
What happens is when someone comes in, they see a series of scenes, in this case indicating different scenes of a mall. They walk themselves from one scene to the next at their own pace, spending as much or as little time with each scene and looking at it as they choose.
Das heißt, hier durch diese Schwingtür, wie immer sie gearbeitet ist, kommt der Mensch in den Raum, macht in etwa 4 Schritte, um aus dem Türzonenbereich herauszukommen und hat dann eine minimale Verharrungsphase, in der er sich erstmal konzentriert und sozusagen in der Lücke noch überlegt, wo geht es jetzt lang. Ja, und da bieten wir ihm dann den berühmten Fokuspunkt, an dem er sich sozusagen optisch ausruhen kann und vor allen Dingen, da haben wir wieder eine Wissenschaft im Marketing, an der er sich orientieren kann. Hintereinander weg. Und oben sammeln wir uns alle wieder hier. Ab wann können Sie den Raum sehen? Ab welcher Treppenstufe? Jetzt ab dem Fall hier oben oder schon vorher? Das ist schon so. Genau, da liegt den Schaubogen. Das ist der erste Blick. Ja. Ab da, wo Sie sind gerade. Ne? Also ab der Mitte der Treppe. Wo schauen Sie automatisch hin bei gerader Kopfhaltung? Ja, aber wohin? Auf welche Position? Steuern Sie das mal. Gehen Sie mal dahin, wo Sie hinschauen. Da haben wir Blickachse, das heißt auf der Linie, auf der sich der Blick bewegt, bis er auf die letztmöglichste Stelle prallt, gibt es verschiedene Positionen. Einer dieser Positionen ist der Fokuspunkt. Und der liegt vor dem Ende dieses Raumes. Das Das heißt, Sie waren schon mit Ihrem Blick sozusagen zu weit weg.
We do the analysis is by taking the elements that we care about, and in this case those elements will be different companies and advertisements. And what we do is we mark out the coordinates that correspond to where they are in the scene. What our computer sees, and the way it analyzes it, is just by the key elements that we have assigned for analysis. This star indicates that most people started the scene looking here. That was the first element that caught their attention. And then their viewing path tended to follow the black arrow towards this other message for Eddie Bauer and onward. And what you see is that because this Haagen-Dazs message was not in the main flow that most people had, the main pattern that they viewed it by, many people missed it.
So, have any of you seen this before?
Yeah.
Kiss Creators Up and Once? You saw it.
Yeah.
Anybody else? It's on the stick in this bad copy of it, but still it's such a great film that it's worth looking at the only passably good quality copy. And it's pretty amazing because throughout the film what he's showing you are the different meetings, the different discussions of people who are financing and designing a shopping mall. And so you see many, many different techniques of design and the kinds of calculations that are behind it and the kinds of results that it produces, because of course he spent a long time, and he also shows you scenes within the finished shopping mall. In particular, there are long sequences where he's talking with the artists who must do the design. So it's really fascinating, this film, and it's like many films by Farrokhי, it is among the best analyses of the contemporary conditions of existence that you will find in a filmic medium. I think it's great. Here we see a contrast between two different types of really instructional activity. One person who's instructing a group of women in the techniques of display, according to concepts and metrics whose development we know nothing about. Where did these concepts of the berühmte Fokuspunkt come from? It's not told in the film. But what is shown is another type of pedagogical activity based on statistical analysis using computational techniques and machinery to follow the movement of the gaze. So you see clearly a very strongly standardizing technique being applied. People are going to be analyzed mathematically, and that analysis is going to be used to transform the way the environment is shaped. But people also use other kinds of knowledge, and you see the discussions with the artists, and one of the designer guys is explaining how he wants to create a kind of symphony. He wants a drum roll here, and then he wants a higher crescendo here, and it should all come to a point of stillness in here, and this is all spatial design talk. So he shows you these different techniques for modulating the experience with the aim that a statistical majority of the people who enter the shopping mall do what? Obviously. Consume and come back and hang out there.
They must like it.
They must like it. So what's going on here? There's somebody who claimed to know exactly what's going on here and made quite a lot of noise about that for quite a long time. Mr. Jean Baudrillard. And he said this: "This is our destiny, subjected to opinion polls, information, publicity, statistics, constantly confronted with the anticipated statistical verification of our behavior, absorbed by this permanent refraction of our least movements, we are no longer confronted with our own will. We are no longer even alienated, because for that it is necessary for the subject to be divided in itself, confronted with the other, contradictory. Now, where there is no other, the scene of the other, like that of politics and of society, has disappeared. Each individual is forced to spite himself into the undivided coherency of statistics. There is in this a positive absorption into the transparency of computers, which is something worse than alienation. Yeah, that's from a text called The Implosion of the Social. By the way, if it's not in the little thing and you want it, just write to me and I'll send it. I forget whether I put it in there or not. Baudrillard had something very strong to say. And one of the things that weakens what he had to say is that he doesn't include the kind of analysis of cybernetics and of its applications that I do. When I started to do this research, my opinion of Baudrillard went up, because I realized that he had himself done similar research, but his rhetoric did not include this research in the same way. And perhaps he hadn't done as much of it. I'm not really sure about that, because, you know, you can clearly see that he was very, very aware of the kind of techniques that are portrayed, for instance, by Farocchi, and he was aware, like Guattari at the time, when those techniques were being really invented and put into play. So this is something very strong. Nonetheless, Guattari hated Baudrillard. Guattari hated Baudrillard. Bifo, Franco Berardi's, who was an Italian refugee, you know, Guattari mobilized French intellectuals in favor of Bifo, who had escaped from Italy in 1979, and the Italian government wanted to extradite him. Bifo recounts, he told us when he was in New York at 16 Livre that at one point Guattari was organizing this great petition that you know, all these famous intellectuals would go and everybody else signed, and Bifo came up to him and he said, I have a great idea, let's get Baudrillard to sign it. And he said, suddenly Guattari became very serious and he said, it's a great idea, we'll get Baudrillard to sign it. But then I won't sign it. So
why did he hate him?
he hated Baudrillard, and he hated postmodernism because he felt that there was an attempt there, and he thought that it was somehow deliberate, to foreclose the possibilities of resistance and creation. So Guattari, faced with these things, said this: where does the idea that the socius is reducible to the facts of language, and that these facts are in turn reducible to binarizable and digitalizable signifying chains come from? On this point, postmodernists, and for him Baudrillard was a postmodernist, and Lyotard as well, have hardly said anything new. In fact, their views are directly in keeping with the modernist tradition of structuralism, whose influence on the human sciences seems to be a carryover from the worst aspects of Anglo-Saxon systematization. In other words, cybernetics, essentially. The secret link that binds these various doctrines, I believe, stems from an underlying relationship marked by reductionist concepts spread immediately after the war by information theory and early cybernetic research. The references that everyone continually made to the new communications and computer technologies were so hastily developed, so poorly mastered, that they put us far behind the phenomenological research that had preceded them. So Guattari was very clearly aware at once of the common origins of structuralism and cybernetics. In fact, structuralism was decisively influenced by cybernetics in the early years immediately after the war. I think I mentioned that Norbert Wiener's book was on cybernetics, communication and control, and the human and the machine, was published first in France at the instigation of a French publisher, something which we tend to forget. So these doctrines were actually well known in France at that time, and they influenced both Lévi-Strauss and Lacan. And now, Guattari was fascinated by cybernetics. But what he wanted to do was to transform it. He did not want to flee from it. He did not want to retreat from it, and certainly not into phenomenology. He believed that machines could be transformed into something other than command and control devices. And so what he wanted to do was carry out some kind of metamorphosis within the really existing machinic relations of contemporary society. And so he asked very strong questions and continued throughout the 80s and up to his death in 1992 to ask why these transformations were not occurring and to propose how they could occur. So we find him asking in the text on molecular revolution, the eternal question, how to invent new kinds of organizations that could work toward a conjunction, a summation of the effects of the molecular revolution, the class struggles in Europe, and the Third World struggles of emancipation. organizations that would be able to respond case by case, if not blow by blow, to the segmentary transformations of IWC, whose precise consequence is that we can no longer speak of undifferentiated masses. How could such assemblages of struggle, unlike traditional organizations, succeed in giving themselves the analytical means that would allow them not to be cut up short by the institutional and technological innovations of capitalism, or by the embryonic revolutionary responses that the workers and populations subjected to IWC try out at each new phase? In other words, how, he wants to know, could we invent revolutionary machines that could actually stand up to all these techniques of manipulation? And when he talks about machines, it's not just metaphorical, he also thinks that the really existing machines should change. So if you look a little later at it, at this text, Regime, Pathways, Subjects, he says, again with this notion of the question, the burning question then becomes this: why have the immense processual potentials brought forth by the revolutions in information processing, telematics, robotics, office automation, biotechnology, and so on, up to now led only to a monstrous reinforcement of earlier systems of alienation, an oppressive mass media culture, and an infantilizing politics of consensus? What would make it possible for them to finally usher in a post-media era, to disconnect themselves from segregative capitalist values, and to give free reins to the first stirrings, visible today, of a revolution in intelligence, sensitivity, and creativity? Guattari is the eternal optimist, you know. Except that apparently he couldn't, according to Bifo, he couldn't deal with other people's depression, and therefore ultimately he couldn't deal with his own. He was always trying to go beyond, you know, and encouraging people to go beyond. And so he had this idea that actually this machine system, this computerized cybernetic machine system could be transformed. And a lot of his work that appears so far-sighted, and especially in the late 90s when the counter-globalization movement found the immense potential of the internet for political organization, at that time Guattari's ideas seemed very, very far-sighted, and in fact it's on that basis that Antonio Negri and Michael Hart wrote their book Empire. They really wrote it directly out of A Thousand Plateaus and out of the subsequent thought of Guattari, which the two, Negri and Guattari, collaborated on several books and on movements, and they were friends.
Michael Hart, when he was here a couple of years ago, said that when Negri first escaped from Italy, he even wrote under the last name of Guattari.
That I don't know.
That he like adopted, like he was like Tony Guattari or Felix.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I would like to find those texts. They co-wrote this text, which has recently been republished by Autonomie by the minor compositions thing that Stephen Chikagis does. So you can get that text on New Spaces of Freedom, or I forget what it's called, something that's sort of called in French anyway. So the question that I want to get to now is going to be a bit surprising for you, because I don't want to go into the whole new technologies thing, because in a way there's a bit of been there and done that. You know, that would not stir your heart, and it doesn't stir mine anymore either, because I think the great things have already been tried there. So I want to go a little deeper and a little more close to the center of Guattari's praxis, which is, you know, psychology and therapy. And actually, none of these things are distinct, because for Guattari, every human practice is a kind of self-organized therapeutic practice, in addition to being a productive practice and a political practice. So for him, these are different sides of something that isn't a coin anymore, right? I mean, these are facets of the human experience. But we won't exactly abandon the thread, the red thread of cybernetics. So one of the people who really influenced Guattari in the 1980s was this man, Moni El-Kaïm. They met, I think, in 1972 in New York, where El-Kaïm, who's Belgian, was organizing psychotherapy clinics in, I think, the Bronx or some poor neighborhoods of greater New York, right? And El-Kaïm eventually published this book, which is probably his most well-known book. And as it says here, it's about undoing reciprocal double binds and other methods of change in couple and family therapy. So he's involved with what's called family therapy, whose other name is systemics. It's actually a systemic theory, and it comes from Gregory Bateson, of course. And so, to introduce you, now, in the 80s, Guattari and Moni El-Kaim started to work together, and they also took part in a seminar that Guattari organized in Paris, and a lot of this seminar was, in a way, a response to El-Kaim. So what was El-Kaim doing? He was involved with family therapy. And here I'm going to borrow from, finally, a good book that was published on Guattari's late work, particularly his schizoanalytic cartographies, my totemic book, which has not been translated in English. And she gives a good resume of what family therapy is. So family therapy is predicated on the premise that a family member's symptom serves the purpose of maintaining homeostasis. Remember we had that concept of homeostasis, the equilibrium, both biological and machinic. A state of stable equilibrium, especially in a living system, within the family as a whole. According to this view, the individual who presents as mentally ill is in fact sustaining the status quo within the family, who needs this individual's symptom in order to keep functioning as it does. And she quotes, "From studies of families containing a schizophrenic member, there can be little doubt that the existence of the patient is necessary for the stability of the family system, and that the system will react quickly and effectively to any internal or external attempts to change its organization." That's from Václavík, who is basically the leader of the so-called Palo Alto School of Systemic Therapy. Václavík, fairly famous guy in France. I don't know, for some reason, I guess because of the prominence of psychotherapy in France. Removing the individual's symptom, then, entails changing the family system. This is explained by the concept of family homeostasis, originally proposed by Don D. Jackson, another member of the Palo Alto School. So she's going to quote, again from the book of which Jackson is one of the authors, quote, "Observing that families of psychiatric patients often demonstrated drastic repercussions, in other words, they had problems when the patient improved, Jackson, quote, postulated that these behaviors, and perhaps therefore the patient's illness as well, were homeostatic mechanisms, operating to bring the disturbed system back into its delicate balance. These theories were developed under the general mentoring of Gregory Bateson and based on the general systems theory of Bertalanffy." I'm not going to say anything more about Bertalanffy, but indeed he developed a general systems theory. Now all of that, of course, is damn interesting, and if you get into it more, it's even more interesting. It's that notion of Bateson, organism plus environment. But, of course, Guattari could not accept this kind of system thinking as an explanation of what human beings are and how they change. Because a system, as I said at the very start of the class, can always be considered by an engineer as a closed system. If you look at it from the outside, and that's exactly what's going on here, you can claim to understand the system perfectly, and you can claim to change the system in order to change the subject. To do such a thing is, of course, to instrumentalize a human being. You were saying that you can totally control this human being. Therefore, Guattari why should he be interested in Moni El-Kaim? Because El-Kaim himself, coming out of this nonetheless very subtle current of thought, had his own questions and was changing what his idea of systemics and his practice of systemics could be. So if we look into the book, we find this. If we look into El-Kaim's own words, we find him saying, I would like to stress the importance of assemblages, Guattari's favorite word, of singularities, which are connected to the therapeutic system. So there's the system, but there are also assemblages of singularities. It is the development of these assemblages that determines whether the system changes or not. Will they be amplified? Will they modify the rules that govern how the system evolves? From this point of view, it is neither the individual nor a system made up of interacting individuals that is crucial, but rather developing assemblages formed of the most diverse elements. These elements cannot be reduced to the most obvious components of the system in question, nor certainly to biologically determined individuals. In other words, the assemblage of singularities is not just a person. It's not just a particularly original person. It's something that may be infra-personal, that may also be, that may be a part of the body, that may be an object, a system of objects, the relation between objects and senses. Something which is actually not computable as an integral member of an integral system. It's a singularity. In philosophy, if I was a philosopher, I would now launch into long discussions of the clinomen, that point where a bifurcation occurs, which is thus named by ancient Greek pre-Socratics, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to continue with Guattari himself from the great book Chaosmosis. And he's actually describing the way that Moni and Cain practice psychotherapy. So Guattari says, let us now examine the use of the psyche's ethological, that is, its animal characteristics, and ecological resources in the domain of family psychotherapy. We are borrowing our example from a movement which, around Moni and Cain, is attempting to free itself from the grip of systemic theories that circulate in Anglo-Saxon countries and in Italy. He's kind of adding it on here. He's saying that these people who are systems theorists, who are practicing family therapy, which is also known as la systémique, he's saying they're attempting to free themselves. Well, he's kind of pushing. He's trying to push them in that direction, but so is El-Qaim. It's mutual. He says, Guattari says, here also the inventiveness of treatment distances us from scientific paradigms and brings us closer to an ethico-aesthetic paradigm. Therapists get involved, take risks, and put their own fantasies into operation, creating a paradoxical climate of existential authenticity accompanied by the freedom of play and simulacra. So there are artificial things and authentic things in there, and all that stuff is moving around. Family therapy produces subjectivity in the most artificial way imaginable. This can be observed in training sessions when the therapists improvise psychodramatic scenes. This is what they would do with the patients. Here the scene implies, or in other words includes, a layering of enunciation, different types of statement, different types of speech, the vision of oneself as a concrete embodiment. I too am a thing within this mix. The subject of enunciation, which doubles the subject of the statement and the distribution of roles. In other words, there's not just what's said, but there's also who's saying it and how it's being said. A collective management of the game. Everyone can intercede and say, no, we've got to change the rules here, this is not working. A verbal exchange with observers commenting on the scene. And finally, a video gaze, which returns all these superimposed levels as feedback. This type of performance favors the relinquishment of a so-called realist attitude, which would apprehend the lived scenes as systems actually embodied in family structures. So in other words, it's in this way that the therapists are led to escape from the grip of systemic theories. Because they've introduced so many singularities into the therapeutic process, the scientific vision, the sort of what Guattari called scientism, will tend to be broken down under the sort of inventive, mobile pressure of this artificiality of the therapeutic system. And it is there, they thought and hoped, that assemblages of singularities, agencement de singularité, could emerge which would lead in unexpected directions whose advantage would be to bring people into touch with experience, and if I can add this, bring them towards what Guattari in later texts calls an authentic hearing of the other. In other words, exactly what Baudrillard was saying was impossible in this transparency of computers where we're all confronted with our statistical image and the scene of the other, and the other, him or herself, has entirely disappeared. So Guattari was tremendously aware of the problem that Baudrillard was talking about, and he was deploying techniques of social interaction in the attempt to face that problem. These techniques led him both to new kind of psychotherapy and to new kinds of political activism. Guattari is the great inspiration, or the North Star, or maybe more likely the South Star, of contemporary political activists in Europe anyway. I mean, the whole movement around Bifo, around the Italian kinds of, all this sort of activism that I was involved in for a long time, and which I continue to love, is really inspired so much by Guattari because he had this double vision of therapy and activism, and he was able to situate it in such a clear consciousness of what, in a way, is actually going on at the level where subjectivity becomes the economy, if you will. So this is why there's so much interest, especially from activists and people who are involved with activism and art, especially for Guattari, and this is obviously also why Negri, and the Italians were so interested in Guattari, etc., etc. So, where exactly does this go? Again, I don't really know, but let's see. Oh yeah, there's another thing we have to
What
add.
did you say? Sorry.
Sometimes I get it
subjectivity becomes the.
Becomes the economy.
Oh,
Becomes the economy. So, the other thing that was crucial about Muniacaim was that he brought someone else into the picture, or rather someone's else, namely Isabel Stengers and Ilya Prigogine, who, both living in Belgium, I think Prigogine, despite his name, I think he was also born in Belgium. Somehow I think he's Russian, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. And they wrote this book together. Basically, Prigogine was a physicist. They both trained as chemists. But Prigogine was a theorist of science, and particularly of physics. Stengers is a philosopher who is interested in the history and theory of science. They wrote a book together, which is a great, great book, and had huge influence in the 80s, called La Nouvelle Alliance, or in French, Order Out of Chaos. So it's something like chaos theory, yeah? And here I again have to recur to myself to describe it, because I couldn't find the perfect quotes in Order Out of Chaos, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what it is. Prigogine and Stengers were chemists concerned with material metamorphoses. Their key concept was that of phase changes at the molecular level, where the introduction of heat energy pushes a liquid beyond its state of equilibrium, so beyond equilibrium, far from equilibrium, giving rise to what they call dissipative structures, from which a new order emerges. Important to this description are moments of bifurcation, where the departure points of new pathways are set by chance. What this meant philosophically was the overcoming of the atemporal outlook characteristic of classical physics, which deduced every moment of a system from an initial state existing independently of the observer. And classical physics is so mechanistic that for them, the arrow of time doesn't matter. You could just as well go in reverse. It would be the same. A thing starts at an initial state, it changes according to causes, it reaches another state, and you can retrace perfectly the way back to the initial state. Change, therefore, was entirely reversible. Energy did not dissipate, and the fundamental identity of physical bodies was conserved. From the new perspective, in other words, things are always the same. Therefore, there are things that you can identify in the system and you can study their interaction. From the new perspective, time appeared irreversible, and the observer was inseparable from its evolution, from the evolution of time, over thresholds of more or less radical discontinuity. Now, this new perspective is the perspective of 19th century entropy. You know, it's the idea of heat. You know, so they're talking history of science. They're not talking their new perspective. They are serious people. Stengers and Prigogine. Now, for the theorist of micropolitical transformations, that is Félix Guattari, such a model could only come as a huge encouragement. If matter itself could be disorganized by an influx of energy to the point of bringing forth an entirely new equilibrium, why not imagine that the passivity and conformism of societies could be thrown into chaos by the introduction of disruptive and paradoxical elements, whether aesthetic, philosophic, sexual, or machinic? Why not imagine that the steady states of industrial society, and indeed the repressive state itself, could dissipate into open potentials for new ways of living? So Guattari was very attentive to what was happening in the sciences. And the reason why is not just because he was a brilliant guy and he loved to read stuff, which apparently seems to be the case. For some reason he had time to read, I don't know how. But he also realized that the emerging integrated world capitalism was based on the application of science, not just to the creation of technical machines, but to the creation of environments. So he knew everything that Baudrillard knew. He knew that people were being statistically analyzed all the time, even at the low infra levels of subjectivity. And he wanted to develop some kind of practice that could respond to this scientism without being scientistic itself, without being based on this sort of cause and effect logic in which you arrive at a vision like that of Baudrillard, which is the vision of anyone who has considered themselves to be part of a deterministic system. I can't quite remember the phrase, but Flaubert, way back in the mid-19th century, basically said something that if A plus B plus C equals essentially me, then in other words, if my cause and effects can be determined, then how far is it between my fist and my own nose? In other words, why don't I just cancel myself if I'm already integrally known by a system of cause and effect? That became, for Guattari, very serious in the face of the advancing environment of what's still behind the image and underneath all these texts, the shopping center. The shopping center and every other type of manipulative environment. And so Guattari wanted to set about not only creating practices, but also creating a theory that could inform those practices, and that could inform the practices without doing what he calls overcoding, which is, of course, the subject of the book there. In other words, without laying on those practices a grid that is so explanatory that can be used to manipulate the very people who are carrying out the practices. So how do you invent a science which is not one? That is Guattari's question. And that is the question that we will look deeply in tomorrow when we look into Guattari's Cartographie Schizoanalytique, which, just to give you kind of an advanced taste of what that is, I could show English translations of some of the diagrams that he's produced. What I want to do tomorrow is to both kind of explore these things and try to see what is meant by the proliferation of these diagrams, which are contained in this book, Cartographie Schizoanalytique, and above all use one of them, this one, to try to explain a lot of things and to set a lot of balls rolling. And after doing that in the first hour and a half, I will then project a film which you will never probably be able to see anywhere else because it's an artistic object which I don't have the right to give to you, made by a friend of mine who did give it to me. And it's a brilliant film. It's actually made by two friends, Maurizio Lazzarato, who is an Italian autonomist philosopher and social theorist, and Angela Melitopoulos, who is a German or Greco-German artist. And they worked together for a long time. In the early 90s, when Guattari was still alive, Angela lived in Paris and hung out with Maurizio and got to know Guattari and all that. And so now they've been working for quite a while on assembling a kind of archive of raw material of Guattari himself, and then making it, and then interviews with people who know him, work with him, and develop his ideas. And then each time, as they assemble the archive, they draw an artistic interpretation out of it as well. And their first effort, that I must say, is quite good. And so I would like to, after trying to explain to you this A signifying system, if you will, or this non-systemic system, or this self-deforming system, we will then look at something which, of course, bears no correspondence whatever to that, but rather pursues the kind of transformations that Guattari himself was interested in the artistic medium. And then after that, we will just talk about it, and that will be the end of the class, right? So that's basically the plan for the end. According to the clock, there is as much as 2 minutes left. So we somehow are finished for the day. But I hope that the ending is less deadly than the beginning, because obviously you've suffered a lot from all these explanations of the financial system. The point was to get us to understand that we are involved in the system, that the system does treat us all as divisible individuals, as Deleuze once said, as particles whose trajectories can be calculated. We're now going to try to look at where